Hey, Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Burnout Resolution Podcast. In today's episode, we're going into part two of burnout and the missing macro. Last week, we talked about the extreme importance of protein intake to beating burnout symptoms. So, if you're suffering from fatigue, not feeling rested no matter how much sleep you get, or having difficulty sleeping, brain fog, and even some mood disorders such as depression, anxiety, just not feeling right, these are all very common symptoms of burnout. And for the last 20 years, as an integrative medical doctor, I've been supporting my clients and walking alongside them to help them resolve these symptoms from the inside out, from their root causes. One of the most important pillars of resolving burnout is the EAT pillar, or pillar number one, as I call it, in our Wellness Warrior 9-week transformation program. So eating is extremely important. And so that inevitably brings up the conversation about vegan versus omnivore diets, or any of the other very common diets: ketogenic, intermittent fasting, Mediterranean diet, paleo diet, on and on the diets go, right? So which one do we choose? How do we know what's right for us? So today we're going to dive into the most controversial one, the most controversial argument of all. Should we or should we not be eating animal-based proteins as part of our diet? And of course, there are social constructs to that, as well as physiological constructs that we're going to break down today. So when we look at a vegan diet, this of course includes the complete elimination of any animal-derived foods, such as eggs or dairy products, and of course beef, any type of poultry, fish, pork, and similar types of, again, animal-derived food. So this diet is based purely on plants. There is some good, solid scientific evidence to back up a vegan diet as an anti-inflammatory diet. We see that the risk of cancer goes down with vegan diets. We also see that the risk of cardiovascular diseases go down significantly. And part of this is because of the consistent anti-inflammatory nature of these diets. For those of us in the West, our diet tends to be highly, highly acidic. And frankly, all food, if we look at it from its structural components, is acidic. So even a plant-based diet contains acids, because the protein building blocks are amino acids and fat building blocks are fatty acids. So we can't get away from acids no matter where we turn. But there are some acids that are better than others, right? Not all acids are created equally. And so the acids that tend to be in animal-based food, especially red meats or gamey meats like goat and lamb, are extremely acidic. Whereas the acids that we might find in vegan protein sources, such as tofu, tempeh, seitan, are less acidic. And so this is where knowing your dynamic metabolic type can be very valuable, because if you have a hot dynamic metabolic type, that's roughly the equivalent of being too acidic. And so a vegan diet would be very suitable as an anti-inflammatory diet. Now, there are also animal-based protein diets that are also anti-inflammatory, and this is also shown in studies. And so how do we reconcile this, right? How can one study say that vegan-based proteins are more anti-inflammatory, but other studies will say that animal-based proteins are also anti-inflammatory? Again, a vegan protein option is excellent if you're too acidic. So if you've taken our burnout assessment and you're a hot dynamic metabolic type, whether you're a hot deficient or a hot excess, having vegan-based protein options would be an excellent solution, because that will reduce the acidity that you're putting into your diet. We would call this more or less an alkaline diet. That would be the equivalent. And so because the vast majority of people who are ill have diabetes, for example, or cardiovascular diseases, histories of cancer, a lot of them are already too acidic. This is why when we do our studies, we see that the vegan diet can be very useful for these people, and also can be very useful in preventing those types of diseases, because those types of diseases involved having too much acidity in the body on some level in the vast majority of cases. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone. So if you're a cold dynamic metabolic type, a vegan diet may actually make you feel worse. It may not actually be anti-inflammatory in your case, and in fact, it may even backfire. There are also some studies that show that vegan diets are not suitable for everyone. And so when we do dynamic metabolic typing, we can automatically get a really good sense of who it might be suitable for and who it might not be suitable for. And so if you haven't taken our burnout assessment yet, I encourage you to go to awakenwellnessnow.com and find out what dynamic metabolic type you have. So that will give you a really good sense of, should I be eating animal products or should I really be sticking to vegan options? Another factor in these studies that we see is that the amount of protein is actually much more important than whether you are vegan or animal-based. And in fact, there are even some studies that show that this becomes a generational issue. This was done in actually rodents. They did a rodent study and fed the mothers low protein diets and observed their offspring. And it wasn't just their direct offspring that had an increased risk of diabetes later in life. Even their grand rats and rodents had the risk of diabetes as well. So it wasn't just from mother to child, it was from mother to grandchild in the case of rodents. And so this really triggers like generational issues. So our more modern studies are showing something very equivalent as well, and that is that low protein intake in general is not great for us. And so what we find in our studies is that eating the correct amount of proteins is actually more important than whether you get it from vegan options or animal-based options. And so if you didn't watch part one of our podcast last week, I encourage you to check it out. More modern studies are showing that we need much, much more protein than we thought. So if you haven't watched that episode, I encourage you to go back and check it out so you get a sense of how much protein do I actually require, because the RDA is not going to tell you. And so the evidence is clear. We need to have enough protein, and that's actually more important. Now, as far as vegan or animal-based, right? So again, animal-based is more acidic. Vegan-based is more alkaline. And so if you're a hot dynamic metabolic type, having a vegan-based protein diet until you're no longer a hot dynamic metabolic type is going to be useful. There is a point at which you might go over the other side of that mountain, and that vegan diet can backfire on you. And I've seen that a lot in my practice. I've had people who've been vegan for years, and it worked for them for several years, and then they hit a wall, and they didn't know what to do because they were already eating really clean. They were doing all the lifestyle things they needed to do. They were getting enough sleep. They were doing exercises that were suitable for them. They were eating the right foods that they thought were healthy. However, their dynamic metabolic type had changed. And so now the diet that was once helpful to them was actually harmful to them. And so we had to encourage them to change from strictly plant-based to incorporating more animal-based proteins. And that was able to kind of get them out of the burnout that they were in and help them to feel much better. And so one of the downsides to the vegan diet is that it is alkaline by its nature. So if you're too alkaline, and yes, there is such a thing as being too alkaline. I know that our cells like to be alkaline and that they function most optimally under those circumstances. However, if there aren't enough acids to balance the alkalinity in those cells, they will malfunction. And so we want to make sure that we, again, don't go too restrictive on our diets and that we know exactly what our individual requirements actually are. And so one of the downsides of the vegan diet is it makes people too cold or too alkaline. Cold in TCM is roughly the equivalent that we could say is too alkaline. Now, again, we can't say that they're equally the same thing because Chinese medicine speaks a completely different language than our Western-based allopathic medicine. And so there is no equal thing. So we can't say that hot means acidic. We can't say that cold means alkaline because they don't. What they're calling hot doesn't only have to do with a temperature. It has to do with how the physiology changes based on that pattern of being too hot. Same thing with cold. It doesn't necessarily mean that your body temperature is too low. It also means that the physiology of the body is responding to this coldness, and that's leading to a pattern that's driving you out of balance. But an alkaline diet makes you perceptually colder. When you're too cold, what's happening is your blood vessels get more constricted. Blood vessels will collapse when they're too cold. They will open when they're warmer. And so if we make ourselves too cold relative to what our body temperature should be, that's why when we stick our hand in an ice bucket, It'll get pale, right? Because your blood vessels will instantly collapse in order to preserve your body temperature. So that means there's less oxygen getting through. That means there's less nutrition getting through. Fewer hormones are getting through because the vessels are narrower. And so this is the consequence of being too cold. You can be too cold on the inside, not just on the periphery, sticking your hand in an ice bucket, but pockets of your body can become too cold depending on where your metabolism is not running properly. So a perception of being too cold, if I feel cold, that means I'm a cold dynamic metabolic type. Now, whether I'm an excess or deficient depends on other factors that you need to take our burnout assessment to determine if you're a cold deficient or a cold excess. But being cold is usually not an indication that a vegan diet is going to be suitable. So when you have a cold dynamic metabolic type, having things that are going to warm you up that are more acidic, for example, will help you to balance yourself out and feel better. And so people that have a cold dynamic metabolic type probably do better avoiding vegan diets. They're probably the ones that in the studies didn't benefit from those vegan diets. And so burnout can be caused by being overly cold, overly hot, being deficient, or being toxic and inflamed, or what we call excess dynamic metabolic types. Now, the reality is, in an ideal world, we want to have a good portion of our proteins being plant-based while mixing in animal-based products as well, so that we have balance. Well, another downfall of the vegan diet, in addition to making people too cold or too alkaline, is also that it's missing essential amino acids, some of the most important ones being lysine. Lysine is classically very low in the vegan diet. So quinoa is an option of getting lysine, lentils are another option. Those sources of protein, though, come with a lot of carbohydrates. And so in order to get enough lysine from vegan options, you have to overconsume carbs. And that's not necessarily favorable. And so this creates a dynamic where certain critical amino acids tend to be lacking in the vegan diet. So lysine, methionine, and leucine are the three that are notoriously low in a vegan diet. They're extremely important for muscle mass synthesis. And so the maintenance of muscle mass, as we talked about in our last podcast, part 1 of the missing macro, muscle mass is extremely important for maintaining your proper weight. If you're not extremely careful in balancing your proteins in a vegan diet, you can lose muscle mass. And that may actually set you up for having more inflammation instead of less inflammation. So again, not just having enough protein, but also making sure that those proteins are actually balanced in your diet is extremely important. So soy will contain some of these amino acids. Again, lentils, Brazil nuts, sesame seeds, and pumpkin seeds. But again, the volume of vegan protein has to be much, much larger than animal-based, sometimes 2 to 3 times as much volume is required in vegan proteins to equal the same amount as what you would find in an animal-based protein. And so again, making sure that you see a nutritionist or a registered dietitian who can help you balance your proteins and amino acid intake is critical for a vegan diet so that you don't slip through those cracks. So a couple quick meals that you can have that are more complete as a vegan would be a tofu stir fry with brown rice or rice and beans, lentil soup and Ezekiel bread, for example. Now, again, you want to be careful not to overconsume the carbs, right? So in order to get the correct amount of protein. And so sometimes a vegan protein option is good to mix in so that you can still get good, healthy food, not overeat the carbs that will give more inflammation, and still get the right amount of protein. So in studies, animal-based lean proteins have the edge on vegan-based proteins for muscle mass. Also, brain health. So vitamin B12 is a critical nutrient for brain health that is sometimes lacking in a vegan diet that is fairly rich in an animal-based diet. Also, omega-3 fatty acids tend to be missing from the vegan diet, and there are some studies to suggest that brain health might be at risk in long-term vegans. There are archaeological and dental records from our remote ancestors that show that we had the most explosive brain development when we began eating animal-based products, and that indeed those nutrients are essential for our brain development. And that's what has differentiated us from our previous ancestors as a species. And so making sure that if you're on a vegan diet, that you're getting enough omega-3 fatty acids in your diet, you're getting enough B12 is extremely important to balance out that vegan diet so that you're able to resolve your burnout or prevent burnout, manage your weight properly, reduce inflammation, and reduce your risk of diseases moving forward. Again, remember that you don't want to overeat carbs to get your protein. And I see this a lot with my private clients who come in and they're not feeling well, they're burnt out, they're exhausted. And when we review their diet, their main source of protein is, for example, beans and lentils. And so they might be eating, for example, 1 cup of lentil beans, but that's only the equivalent of 10 grams of protein. And if you are a 150-pound male or female, that's not going to be enough protein because you're going to have to compensate for that in your other 2 meals, which again, if you're still eating beans and lentils in your other meals and you're not consuming enough protein, you're not going to meet those targets. And so this is the confusion that comes in. It's not that those foods aren't healthy, it's that they're not completely going to fulfill your nutritional requirements. And now that we know we need a lot more protein than what we used to think, this becomes even more important for burnout resolution and prevention. The other issue is bioavailability of foods. And so again, a vegan diet, especially if it's raw, is much harder to digest and absorb, whereas an animal-based diet is easier to absorb. Now, what are the downsides of the animal-based or omnivore diet? So again, if it's not balanced in the same way, you can become extremely acidic on that kind of diet. And that can introduce risks of disease that are associated with acidity, like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and much more. And acidity does lead to burnout. Your cells don't function as well when they're too acidic. So, like everything else in holistic medicine, it's all about balance. So, if we have too little oxygen, we're in danger. If we have too much oxygen, we're actually in danger too. So there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. It's always about balance. And so it's the same thing with animal-based proteins. If you're consuming too much, and if those foods are highly acidic, then you might be, again, going down that slippery slope to burnout and potentially diseases. And so balancing your animal-based proteins is also important. Now, again, red meat and goat and lamb are extremely acidic food. That doesn't mean you shouldn't eat them or can't eat them, but they are ideal for someone with a cold dynamic metabolic type. Again, whether you're excess or deficient, warming yourself up is important. And those foods are warming, right? That's where we get the term meat sweats when we have steak and things like that. They're literally warming up your body. And so if you're too cold, that's great. But if you're too hot and already acidic, that's going to backfire. So foods that are more neutral, that are animal based, are poultry, fish, eggs, pork, and of course, vegan options. Now, if you're a cold dynamic metabolic type, then having a little bit more red meat, lamb, and goat are a good idea until you're not cold anymore, right? So you don't want to go down the other side of that mountain. So once you have reached equilibrium where you're temperature neutral, you want to slow down on those types of meats that are going to make you hotter and hotter and hotter, right? Because they're going to backfire on you. Now you want to lessen the highly acidic meats and focus more on the neutral and vegan options. So this is how we stay balanced on top of the mountain and not go off on either side, right? Causing avalanches and issues we don't want to deal with on the periphery. You want to stay on top of the mountain. And so this is where studies on animal-based proteins increasing the risk of heart disease and cancer and things like that come in. If you're eating a standard American diet, you are probably acidic already because that type of diet is extremely acidic. And so this is where you're going to increase your risk. If you're already eating healthy and you're not really eating the sad diet, so to speak, then being more in the middle is probably important, right? Having some red meat in your diet, majority neutral meats, and vegan options as well is going to keep you again on top of that mountain, which is really important. So animal-based proteins have the advantage of brain health preservation as well as muscle mass preservation. They can also be anti-inflammatory if you're using them in a balanced way. So which is better? Is it plant-based? Is it the omnivore diet? We're supposed to be omnivores, right? If we look back at our dental records and archaeological discoveries that have been made in the last couple decades, we are omnivores. In other words, whatever we could catch and eat, is what we would eat. So nothing was off the table for us. Now we can use the vegan option strategically or preferentially. So if we have social reasons, right, there are myriad reasons why people may have an issue with animal-based diets based on how we have abused and inhumanely raised and slaughtered these animals. Being very compassionate about how we feed ourselves is extremely important. So the way that I personally reconciled eating animal-based proteins is to make sure that I buy them from manufacturers that raise them humanely, feed them properly, and process them properly. That doesn't mean I don't eat plant-based proteins, I do as well, but the vast majority of my protein comes from animal-based sources. So I have clients who do not want to harm animals because they feel that spiritually, emotionally, it's just their choice. And that's perfectly fine. And that can work. You just want to make sure that it's extremely well balanced and probably be under the care of a registered dietitian and a nutritionist to make sure that your diet is balanced so you don't suffer the consequences that can come from the vegan diet if you're not careful with it. And for omnivores, getting your meats and eggs and other sources of animal-based proteins in a humane way and in a way where they're not fed hormones, in a way that they're not fed foods that are pesticide laden or genetically modified is extremely important. Pesticides, genetic modification, being fed artificial hormones makes those food sources less healthy. And so again, this kind of pours gas on fire to increase acidity and to make people unhealthy. Organic-based animal products are extremely important wherever you can get them. Wild-caught fish, extremely important. Now again, the mercury aside, right? That's an issue, so watch the big hunter fish. However, having shellfish and other fish that are not hunter fish can be safely done when they're wild caught as well. Pasture raised, those are extremely important so that you can feel that you're being ethical about your meal choices, environmentally responsible, and also maintaining your health. So, which is better? The shocking truth about whether a vegan diet or omnivore diet is actually better is that what actually makes the food more healing is if you eat mindfully. So if you're not mindful about your food, if you're running around paying attention to all kinds of other things, you're multitasking, watching TV, answering emails while you're chewing and swallowing, eating on the run, you're not going to digest and absorb your food properly. So it doesn't matter if you're vegan or omnivore or anything in between, it's not going to work. So there are tons of studies coming out now to show that mindful eating is actually more important than what you eat. So how you eat is actually much more important than what you eat. What is mindful eating? It's being completely present with your food and not doing anything else while you're eating and actually feeling what you're eating. So the sensory experience of eating is extremely important and being aware of the sensory experience, the texture of the food, the taste of the food, how it's going down into your stomach, the gratitude for the food. Mindful breathing while you're eating is extremely important. And now we have science to back up what we should have known logically, right? Makes sense that we probably shouldn't be eating and running or eating and watching TV. If I'm focused on something else, that means my blood flow is not going to my gastrointestinal system where it needs to go, right? So if I'm in my head worrying about the next hour of things that I need to do and how I'm going to plan all that, I'm sending a bunch of blood flow to my brain and it's being diverted from my gut, right? So I'm not going to absorb as well. And studies show we don't make enzymes as well. We don't release enzymes as well. We don't manage our blood sugar as well if we're not actually focused on the food that we're eating and the experience of actually eating that food. Also, whether or not you feel hungry or full is dependent on whether or not you're eating mindfully. And although that may be shocking, the studies are becoming quite clear now. We need to be present with our food. We need to be present during our meal times and put everything else to the side. So that means putting your phone on do not disturb, turning off the TV, and just being with the plate of food that's in front of you. And proper breathing, right? Doing your heart math breathing would be amazing while you're chewing your food because you don't use your mouth when you do heart math breathing. So you're just breathing through your nostrils and it's just a nice natural rhythm and flow. And so the shocking truth about whether or not a vegan diet or an omnivore diet is better is that it doesn't matter if you're not eating mindfully. And if you are eating mindfully, you're going to absorb your nutrients much better. They're going to be much more bioavailable. Your hunger and fullness cycles will be much better balanced. So you're not overeating, undereating, having cravings, and you get grounded and centered at the same time. So you get to relax and shut everything off while you're focused on your meal. And so I hope this podcast has been helpful to you and that you got some quick applicable tips that you can use. And our 7-day Metabolic Burnout Resolution Challenge drops on July 8th. So if you haven't yet registered, please click the link below and register for the 7-day challenge. We are going to put everything we just talked about in our last 2 podcasts in a 7-day challenge so that you can start knowing exactly what you need to do to get yourself out of burnout. We're going to give you step-by-step plans each and every day so that at the end of the 7 days, you're going to be well on your way to burnout resolution, feeling much better, less brain fog, much more mindfully focused and relaxed. You don't want to miss it. So join Awaken Wellness Nation now for our free 7-day challenge coming up July 8th. For more information, please visit our website, awakenwellnessnow.com. If you want to know about our corporate wellness options, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to share our corporate burnout assessment with you and talk to you about our programs. So thank you so much for listening. As always, if you like today's podcast, please share it with friends, subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you this amazing content. And until next time, thank you and many, many blessings.